Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Before the empire that stretched across 3 continents, there was a single step. A step taken by one man, Orhan Gazi, who dared to look across the water not as a raider, but as a conqueror. While the magnificent Byzantine Empire rotted from within, consumed by civil war, its emperors made a fatal mistake. They invited the wolf to guard the sheep. This is the story of the Sultan who answered that call, who crossed the threshold of history and planted a banner on European soil from which an empire would grow to challenge the world. In the rugged heart of Anatolia, where empires are born in fire and shattered like clay, a shadow fell long and deep. It was the shadow of Osman Ghazi, the founder, the warrior mystic whose name would echo through eternity. And in that formidable shadow stood his son, Orhan. To inherit a throne is one thing, to inherit a prophecy is another entirely. Orhan did not receive a crown of gold or a palace of marble. He inherited a sword, a saddle, and a divine dream, a vision of a tree growing from his father's heart to shelter the world. This was not a kingdom of defined borders and tax rolls. It was a Ghazi principality, a Beylik, a brotherhood of warriors bound by faith, loyalty, and the promise of conquest. Osman's legacy was one of relentless, opportunistic warfare against a decaying Byzantine Empire. He was a creature of the frontier, a master of the raid, the ambush, the lightning strike. But a state cannot be built on raids alone. An empire cannot be sustained from a nomad's tent. This was the challenge that awaited Orhan. He had ridden beside his father, learned the art of war at his knee, and felt the pulse of their people's ambition. He understood the warrior spirit that fueled them, but he also saw its limitations. The world was changing. The Byzantines, though weakened, were not fools. They had stone walls, organized armies, and centuries of imperial statecraft. To defeat them, the Ottomans had to become more than just the most successful band of frontier warriors. They had to become a state. They needed laws, a currency, a capital. Orhan, standing over the fresh grave of his legendary father around 1324, must have felt the crushing weight of this future. He was no longer just a warrior chieftain's son. He was the vessel of the Ottoman destiny, tasked with turning his father's fierce nomadic dream into an enduring terrestrial power. The history of royal succession is a river of blood, a chronicle of brothers turning on brothers for the ultimate prize of power. In the centuries to come, the Ottoman dynasty itself would codify the brutal practice of fratricide to prevent civil war. But in this nascent era, something remarkable, something foundational occurred. The throne passed not through violence, but through wisdom and fraternal devotion. Upon Osman's death, the mantle of leadership was not automatically Orhan's. He had an elder brother, Alaeddin. By the customs of the Turkic tribes, Alaeddin was the rightful heir. The warriors and elders gathered, expecting the customary division of the father's legacy. It was here that the character of the new generation was forged. Orhan, recognizing his brother's right, offered to divide their father's small domain. But Alaeddin was a different kind of man. He was not a frontline warrior in the mold of his father or brother. He was a scholar, a jurist, a man of piety and administration. He saw in Orhan the martial fire, the strategic mind, and the charisma necessary to lead the Ghazi warriors. He understood that a divided state was a dead state. In an act that would define the early empire's spirit, Alaeddin refused the throne. He refused any division of power. He declared, "My brother, you are the chosen one to shepherd our people. I will be your servant, your advisor." He asked only for the revenues of a single village for his sustenance. Orhan, in turn, refused to let his brother be a mere pensioner. He insisted that Alaeddin, with his keen intellect and knowledge of Islamic law, take on a new, vital role. He would not be a rival sultan, but the state's first grand vizier, the chief minister, the architect of the civil and military administration. This was not a rejection of power, but a redefinition of it. One brother would be the sword, the other, the mind. One would expand the borders, the other would build the institutions within them. This partnership became the bedrock of the fledgling state, a testament to a shared vision that valued unity over personal ambition. Nomadic people cannot rule a settled empire. A state on horseback has no permanent heart. Orhan understood this with chilling clarity. While his father had raided and harassed the great Byzantine city of Prusa, known today as Bursa, he had never been able to take it. The city, nestled at the foot of Mount Uludağ, was a fortress, a jewel of Bithynia, protected by massive walls and Roman engineering. Taking it would not be a matter of a cavalry charge or a surprise attack. It would require a completely new kind of warfare for the Ottomans, the slow, grinding, soul-crushing art of the siege. For nearly a decade, starting in the final years of his father's reign, Orhan tightened the noose. This was not a constant bloody assault, but a strategic strangulation. He built 2 imposing forts to control the approaches to the city, cutting off its supplies and communication with Constantinople. The message was clear. Nothing would get in, and no one would get out. The city would starve. This was a war of patience, of logistics, of engineering, a profound evolution from the nomadic tactics of the past. The years crawled by. Inside the walls, hope dwindled, turning to despair. Food became a memory. The vibrant silks and trade that had made Bursa wealthy were gone, replaced by the grim reality of isolation. The Byzantine Empire, beset by problems on all sides, could send no relief. Finally, in 1326, the city's commander surrendered. Orhan rode not into a sacked and burning ruin, but into his future. He treated the populace with clemency, allowing those who wished to leave to do so with their possessions. Those who stayed were guaranteed their lives and religious freedom. Bursa was not just conquered, it was adopted. Orhan immediately declared it the new Ottoman capital, the Bey Sankar. Mosques, schools, and public baths were commissioned. The city's famous hot springs became a center of life. The nomadic chieftain now had a throne, and his wandering tribe had a home. The fall of Bursa was the moment the Ottoman Beylik put down roots, transforming from a frontier phenomenon into a territorial state with a heart of stone and mortar. Conquest is chaos. Governance is order. With the great city of Bursa as his capital, Orhan, guided by the steady hand of his brother Alaeddin, embarked on the most crucial campaign of his reign, not one of swords, but of systems. The warrior band that had followed his father needed to be transformed into the apparatus of a modern state. The first and most symbolic step was the creation of an independent currency. No longer would the Ottomans use the coins of other rulers. Orhan ordered the minting of the silver akçe, stamped with his own name, and the Islamic declaration of faith. This was a declaration of sovereignty, a tangible piece of the new state that a soldier or a merchant could hold in his hand. It announced to the world that the House of Osman was a power in its own right. Next came the army. The old system of volunteer Ghazi warriors, while effective for raids, was unreliable for sustained campaigns and garrison duty. A permanent professional force was needed. Thus, the first standing army was created, the Yaya, the infantry, and the Musellem, the cavalry. These were paid, uniformed soldiers, loyal directly to the Sultan, not to a tribal chieftain. This was a revolutionary step, freeing the ruler from dependence on fickle tribal loyalties and creating a disciplined military machine that would become the envy of the world. With Alaeddin as Grand Vizier, a civil administration, the Divan, was formalized to manage the growing territories, collect taxes, and administer justice. A distinct Ottoman identity began to emerge, symbolized by a new white cap for the soldiers, distinguishing them from the other Turkic beyliks. Each reform was a brick, meticulously laid upon the foundation of conquest. Orhan was building the machine of empire, a treasury filled with his own coins, a bureaucracy to manage his lands, and a professional army to defend and expand them. The nomadic dream was being codified in law and forged in silver. The Beylik was dying, and in its place, a formidable organized state was being born. By the mid-14th century, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was a ghost haunting its own capital. Constantinople, the queen of cities, was a gilded husk, its vast walls protecting a dwindling populace plagued by poverty, plague, and incessant political intrigue. The imperial throne itself was the epicenter of this decay. The death of Emperor Andronikos III, Palaiologos, in 1341, left his 9-year-old son, John V, as heir. But power abhors a vacuum. Into it stepped the boy's ambitious regent, the grand domestic John Cantacuzénos, a man who saw the purple robes of the emperor not on the child, but on himself. This ambition ignited a ruinous civil war, a self-inflicted wound from which Byzantium would never recover. Cantacuzénos was a brilliant statesman and soldier, but he was opposed by a powerful faction in the capital, led by the Dowager Empress Anna of Savoy. As the conflict bled the empire's last resources, Cantacuzénos found himself increasingly isolated, outmaneuvered by his rivals who had secured the backing of the Serbians and Bulgarians. Cornered and desperate, his gaze turned eastward, across the Sea of Marmara, to the rising power he had watched with a mix of apprehension and respect: Orhan Gazi. He needed an ally whose warriors were feared, whose loyalty could be bought, and who had no stake in the complex web of Balkan politics. He needed the Ottomans. To secure this alliance, Cantacuzénos made a move that sent a shockwave of horror through the Christian world. He offered Orhan something more valuable than gold or territory, a key to the heart of the empire itself. He offered the hand of his own daughter, the Princess Theodora, in marriage. A Christian princess, a descendant of Roman emperors, was to be given to a Muslim Turk, a man his own people considered a barbarian chieftain. Theodora was no longer a person. She was a chess piece in her father's deadly game for the throne, a living sacrifice on the altar of his ambition. The offer of a princess was a shocking prelude, but the war waited for no one. By 1345, John Cantacuzénos's position was catastrophic. His primary Balkan ally, the Serbian king Stefan Dušan, had betrayed him, seizing the opportunity to conquer Byzantine lands in Macedonia and Albania for himself. Hemmed in, his armies depleted, Cantacuzénos was besieged in the Thracian city of Didymoteicho by forces loyal to the regency in Constantinople. His dream of wearing the imperial purple was dissolving into a nightmare of defeat and humiliation. It was from this crucible of desperation that the formal call was made. This was no longer a negotiation between powerful neighbors. This was a plea for survival. Messengers were dispatched on swift ships, carrying letters not only promising the Princess Theodora, but begging Orhan for immediate military intervention. The fate of the man who would be emperor now rested entirely in the hands of the Ottoman Sultan. For Orhan, this was a moment of supreme strategic clarity. He had observed the Byzantine civil war with a predator's patience, watching his ancient rival tear itself apart. He understood the profound weakness that Cantacuzénos's request represented. The Romans, the heirs of Caesar and Constantine, were now incapable of settling their own affairs. They needed him. Accepting the call was a risk. It meant inserting his forces into the treacherous vortex of European politics. But the potential reward was immeasurable. It was a formal invitation to cross the Hellespont, not as an invader to be repelled, but as a sanctioned ally. It offered him legitimacy, a foothold, and an unparalleled opportunity to study the military and political landscape of Thrace from the inside. Orhan weighed the emperor's desperate plea against the future of his own people. The decision he made would not just save Cantacuzénos, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power between two continents and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to the fall of Constantinople itself. Orhan's response was swift and decisive. He did not send a token force. He dispatched his eldest son and most brilliant commander, Süleyman Pasha, at the head of nearly 6,000 of his finest cavalry. These were not conscripts or levies. They were seasoned Ghazis, warriors forged in the relentless campaigns of Anatolia, motivated by faith, loyalty, and the promise of plunder. In 1345, their ships sliced through the waters of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that had separated Asia from Europe since the dawn of history. As their horses stepped onto the Gallipoli Peninsula, a threshold was crossed. For the first time, an organized Ottoman military force was operating on European soil by invitation of a Roman emperor. Their arrival was like a lightning strike in the stagnant theatre of the war. The Byzantine and Bulgarian forces besieging Cantacuzénos at Didymoteicho were complacent, accustomed to the indecisive, slow-paced warfare of the Balkans. They were utterly unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Ottoman horsemen. Suleiman's warriors descended upon their camps with terrifying efficiency, scattering the besieging army and shattering its command. Cantacuzénos was saved. But for the Greek peasants of Thrace, salvation felt like a new kind of terror. They watched in horror as these foreign warriors, speaking an alien tongue and fighting with a brutal effectiveness, swept across their lands. Though they were officially allies of the emperor, their raids on enemy territory were indistinguishable from conquest. They seized livestock, burned villages, and carried off captives. To Suleiman and his men, this was a revelation. They saw a land rich in plunder, weakened by internal division, and defended by armies that could not stand against them. This was not merely a mercenary expedition to save an ally. It was a reconnaissance in force, a preview of a conquest they now knew was possible. The first steps in Europe were taken not as conquerors, but the shadow they cast was long and ominous. With the might of the Ottomans behind him, the tide of the civil war turned irrevocably. In 1347, John Cantacuzénos marched into Constantinople and was crowned co-emperor, his ambition finally realized. The centerpiece of his victory celebration was the wedding of his daughter, Theodora, to Orhan. The lavish ceremony was a somber, surreal affair, a public spectacle of the Faustian bargain he had made. The Christian emperor had won his throne, but he had given the keys of Europe to his Muslim father-in-law. It quickly became apparent that this was not an alliance of equals. Orhan was not a mercenary to be paid and dismissed. He was now the ultimate arbiter of power in the region. Cantacuzénos, now Emperor John VI, found his throne propped up by the very Ottoman soldiers his people feared. He needed them to counter his domestic rivals, to fight the Serbians, and to maintain his precarious hold on power. Orhan was more than willing to provide this support, but always at a price. The relationship was inverted. The Roman emperor was now the junior partner. When Orhan requested aid, it was not a request. He demanded Byzantine ships to cross into Europe and Byzantine guides to navigate the terrain. His warriors were granted the right to raid the territories of Cantacuzénos's enemies, and they did so with a brutal efficiency that enriched the Ottoman state and demoralized the whole of Thrace. The steady stream of wealth, slaves, and intelligence flowing back to Bursa fueled further Ottoman expansion. Cantacuzénos had imagined he was using Orhan as a tool. He discovered too late that he was the one being used. Orhan treated him with the formal respect due to a father-in-law, but in matters of state, he was implacable. The Ottomans were not vassals or mere allies. They were a sovereign power, operating within the empire's borders at the emperor's own invitation. The price for Cantacuzénos's crown was the permanent Ottoman presence in Europe, a presence that would soon move from raiding party to occupying army. In the annals of empires, there are moments so perfectly timed, so brutally decisive, that they defy rational explanation. They feel like the hand of fate, or God, sweeping the pieces from the board. For the Byzantine Empire, that moment came on the night of March 2nd, 1354. The Dardanelles Strait, the mythic Hellespont, had for centuries been the impregnable watergate protecting Europe from Anatolia. The key to that gate was the fortress city of Gallipoli. It was Byzantium's sentinel, a stone testament to Roman engineering and resilience. But stone is no match for the earth's fury. That night, a violent earthquake tore through the Thracian peninsula. The ground convulsed, and the mighty walls of Gallipoli, which had repelled countless sieges, were shattered. Towers collapsed into rubble. Gates were wrenched from their hinges. The very foundations of Byzantine security were cracked open. On the other side of the strait, in Anatolia, was Orhan's eldest and most ambitious son, Suleiman Pasha. He had watched Gallipoli for years, a predator studying its prey. When the tremors subsided and scouts brought word of the devastation, Suleiman saw not a natural disaster, but a divine invitation. He didn't hesitate. Gathering his best warriors, he crossed the narrow strait under the cover of darkness. The Byzantine garrison, terrified and demoralized by the earthquake, offered little resistance. They saw the Ottoman banners appear through the dust and ruin, not as invaders, but as harbingers of an apocalypse. Suleiman Pasha's forces walked through the gaping breaches in the walls and seized the most strategic fortress in the region without a single catapult shot. To the Ottomans, it was a miracle, a clear sign of Allah's favor. To the Byzantines, it was a nightmare made real, a sign that God had finally abandoned them. The earth had opened the door, and the future had just walked in. The capture of a city, even one as vital as Gallipoli, was not unprecedented. For decades, Ottoman raiders had crossed into Thrace, plundering towns and enslaving populations before retreating back to Anatolia with their spoils. The European powers had grown accustomed to these swift, brutal incursions. They were painful, but temporary. What Orhan and Suleiman did next, however, changed the nature of the conflict forever. This was not to be a raid. It was to be a migration, an implantation. Immediately following the seizure of Gallipoli, a systematic and organized effort began. The remaining Greek inhabitants were moved out, and the city was prepared for new occupants. Across the strait, a call went out. Orhan's administration began transporting thousands of Turkish and Arab families from across Anatolia. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and their families. They brought their livestock, their tools, and their faith. Ships that had once carried warriors now ferried entire communities. The city of Gallipoli, and soon the surrounding towns of the peninsula, were methodically repopulated. The urban landscape began to transform. Churches were converted into mosques, their bells silenced and replaced by the muezzin's call to prayer. Bazaars sprang up, filled with the goods and dialects of Anatolia. The Greek language faded, replaced by Turkish. This was a masterstroke of long-term strategic thinking. Orhan understood that a fortress held only by soldiers is vulnerable, but a city inhabited by families, a land tilled by your own people, becomes a part of your homeland. He wasn't just building a military outpost. He was creating a permanent, self-sustaining Ottoman province on European soil. Gallipoli became the Chimpe Kalesi, the first piece of an empire to come. It was the unbreakable bridgehead, the anchor from which the conquest of the Balkans would be launched. Europe now had a permanent, growing wound in its side. In the gilded halls of Constantinople, the news of Gallipoli's fall landed like a death sentence. For Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, it was a moment of supreme and bitter irony. He was the man who had brought the Ottomans into Europe. For years, in his ruinous civil war against his rivals, he had relied on Orhan's fierce warriors as mercenaries. He had even given his own daughter, Theodora, to the aging Sultan in marriage to secure the alliance. He had treated the Ottomans as a tool, a convenient weapon to be used and put away. Now, the weapon was turning in his hand. Cantacuzene was a scholar and a shrewd politician. He understood the strategic catastrophe immediately. He dispatched envoys to Orhan, his ally, his son-in-law. He pleaded. He reminded Orhan of their pacts, of the assistance he had provided. He offered a staggering sum of money, 10,000 gold ducats, if Orhan would simply evacuate Gallipoli and return it to the empire. The emperor still believed he was dealing with a mercenary chieftain who could be bought. He had fundamentally misjudged his man. Orhan's reply was a masterpiece of cold, unassailable logic, laced with divine justification. He calmly explained to the emperor's envoys that he had not taken the city by force of arms. The Byzantines had not surrendered it, nor had his soldiers breached its walls. No, God himself, in his divine wisdom, had delivered the city into his hands through the earthquake. It was a gift from Allah. And who was he, a humble servant, to return a gift from God? The message was clear. The old rules no longer applied. The relationship of convenience was over. Orhan was no longer a hired sword for Byzantine quarrels. He was an independent power acting on his own destiny, a destiny he now saw as divinely sanctioned. For Cantacuzénos, the realization must have been chilling. The fire he had invited into his house to smoke out his enemies was now consuming the house itself. The fall of Gallipoli was more than a Byzantine problem. It was a paradigm shift for all of Christendom. For centuries, the great threat of Islam had been contained. The Crusades had been fought in a distant Holy Land. The Moors in Spain were being pushed back. The great enemy was always over there, across the sea. But now, the sea was no longer a barrier. The news travelled on the swift galleys of Venetian and Genoese merchants, whispered in the ports of Ragusa, Venice, and Rome. At first, it was just another story of Byzantine incompetence, another chapter in the slow, agonizing decay of the Eastern Roman Empire. But as the reports of mass Turkish colonization became undeniable, the mood shifted from scorn to alarm. This was different. This was permanent. The gaze from Anatolia, which had long looked across the water with ambition, was now staring at Europe from within its own frontiers. The Ottomans were no longer a foreign power to be hired or placated. They were a European power. The Balkan kingdoms, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, suddenly found a voracious and organized new neighbor on their doorstep, a neighbor with a foothold that could not be dislodged. In Rome, the papacy, already weakened by schism, saw the emergence of a threat that could potentially dwarf all others. A crusade was called for by Pope Clement VI, but the call fell on deaf ears. The great powers of Western Europe were consumed by their own conflicts, chiefly the 100 Years' War between England and France. They failed to grasp the magnitude of the moment. They did not understand that the small bridgehead at Gallipoli was the beginning of a tidal wave. For the first time, the fear was not of a raid, but of a conquest. A slow, methodical, and divinely inspired conquest that aimed for the heart of the continent. A new and terrifying chapter in the relationship between Islam and Christendom had begun, born from the rubble of a fallen fortress. The sword can conquer, but it cannot hold. Orhan understood this truth in his very bones. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Bithynia, a new challenge emerged, one not of warfare, but of creation. The Ghazi warrior, the raider chief, had to become a sovereign, a statesman, an architect of civilization. His captured cities, Bursa and Iznik, were not merely to be garrisoned. They were to be transformed into the heart of a new world. This was the moment the Ottoman enterprise pivoted from a nomadic warband into a settled, enduring state. In Bursa, rising from the ashes of Byzantine decay, Orhan commanded the construction of his first great mosque, the Haçı Özbek Cami. It was more than a place of worship. It was a declaration. It stamped the city with an indelible Islamic and Turkish identity, a symbol of permanent conquest. Beside the mosques, he built imarets, public soup kitchens that fed the poor, the traveller, and the student. This was a masterstroke of public relations and genuine piety, binding the populace to their new ruler, not through fear, but through provision. The pulse of his new state would be commerce. Bustling bazaars, or bedestans, were constructed, secure hubs where merchants from east and west could trade under the Sultan's protection. The flow of silver, silk, and spices became the lifeblood of his nascent empire. But Orhan's greatest foresight lay in the establishment of the madrases, the institutions of higher learning. He knew his empire needed more than warriors. It needed judges, scribes, imams, and administrators. He invited scholars from across the Muslim world, creating an intellectual center in Bursa that would forge the Ottoman elite for generations. This was Orhan's quiet revolution, the transformation of plunder into taxes, of raiders into administrators, and of a war camp into a capital city. He was laying down the administrative and cultural foundations, brick by brick, law by law, upon which his descendants would build a world empire. Power in the Turkish world had always been a precarious negotiation. A sultan was only as strong as the loyalty of his tribal beys, the powerful families who had ridden with his father and grandfather. These men had their own lands, their own ambitions, their own loyalties. They were partners in conquest, but also potential rivals in power. Orhan, in his quiet, calculating way, saw the danger. To build a true empire, he needed an army loyal not to a tribe, not to a family, but to him and him alone. The solution he devised was radical, ruthless, and brilliant. It was an institution that would become a legend and a terror, the Janissaries. The concept began with the pensik, the 1/5 tax levied on the spoils of war. Orhan's administrators reinterpreted this to include human captives. The strongest, brightest, and youngest Christian boys taken in battle were separated from the rest. They were not enslaved in the traditional sense. They were to be remade. Torn from their families, their faith, and their names, they were brought to the heart of the Ottoman world. They were converted to Islam, taught the Turkish language, and subjected to the most rigorous military and intellectual training imaginable. They were forbidden to marry or own property. Their father, their brother, their only family was the Sultan himself. They were his slaves, and yet they were the elite. This new corps, the Yeniçeri, or new soldiers, were armed with the finest weapons and instilled with a fanatical esprit de corps. They answered to no tribal chieftain. They owed allegiance to no one but the man on the throne. With their creation, Orhan shattered the old order. He had forged a tool of absolute power, a standing army of unparalleled discipline that would serve as the foundation of Ottoman military supremacy for centuries. He had created men who were, in essence, the children of the state. Orhan reigned for 34 years. In an age of assassins' daggers, battlefield deaths, and sudden plagues, this was an eternity. He ascended the throne as a young, vigorous warrior, fighting alongside his father Osman. He would die an old man, having outlived nearly everyone he began the journey with. This immense span of time forged the empire, but it also exacted a heavy personal toll. The weight of decades in power creates a profound and inescapable solitude. The comrades who once shared a saddle and a campfire with him were long gone. The tribal elders who had advised him in his youth were silenced by time. He was no longer Orhan the Ghazi, first among equals. He was the Sultan, an institution, a remote figure veiled by the growing ceremony of his own court. His world, once defined by the raw immediacy of the frontier, was now one of decrees, administrators, and the quiet, ceaseless hum of a state he had built from nothing. The greatest blow, the one that would cast a long, dark shadow over his final years, was the death of his eldest son, Suleiman Pasha. Suleiman was everything Orhan could have wished for in an heir. He was a brilliant commander, the hero who had led the Ottomans across the Dardanelles and planted their first banner in Europe at Gallipoli. He was the future. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, he was gone, killed not in a glorious battle, but in a common hunting accident, thrown from his horse. For the aging Sultan, this was a wound beyond measure. It was the loss of a beloved son, but also the shattering of his carefully laid plans for succession. The empire's future was suddenly uncertain. In his final years, Orhan was a man who had achieved unimaginable success, transforming a tiny principality into a formidable power that made Byzantine emperors tremble. Yet, he was also a grieving father, an isolated sovereign, haunted by the ghost of the son who should have carried his legacy forward. While armies clashed and cities fell, a different kind of war was waged within the silent, guarded walls of the palace. The Ottoman harem was not a den of leisure. It was the political heart of the dynasty, a crucible where the future of the empire was forged in the fires of love, ambition, and bitter rivalry. Orhan's marital alliances were masterstrokes of diplomacy. His Turkish wife, Nilüfer Hatun, a woman of noble birth, provided him with his son Murad, securing the Turkish foundations of his rule. But his most audacious move was his marriage to a Christian princess, Theodora, the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor, John VI Cantacuzene. This union was a stunning political statement. It brought the Ottoman Sultan directly into the labyrinthine world of Byzantine imperial politics, making him a kingmaker and king-breaker in Constantinople itself. Theodora remained a Christian, a symbol of the complex, symbiotic, and ultimately predatory relationship Orhan was cultivating with the dying Roman Empire. But these powerful women were not just political pawns, they were mothers, and their sons were rivals for the throne. The designated heir was Suleiman Pasha, the conqueror of Gallipoli, a son from another wife. His preeminence was undisputed until his sudden tragic death threw the entire succession into chaos. With Suleiman gone, the focus shifted to his younger half-brothers, Murad, the son of Nilufar, and Halil, the son of Theodora. The tension was palpable. Then, disaster struck again. The young Prince Halil was kidnapped by Genoese pirates from the shores of the Sea of Marmara. This was not just a family tragedy, it was a state crisis. Orhan, the formidable ruler, was forced into humiliating negotiations, paying a massive ransom with the help of his Byzantine father-in-law to retrieve his son. The incident exposed the dynasty's vulnerability and subtly shifted the balance of power. In the end, it was Murad, the son of the Turkish noblewoman, who would emerge as the strongest contender, a man hardened and prepared by the brutal, uncertain politics of his father's house. In the year 1347, a terror unlike any other arrived from the east. It was not an army of horsemen, nor a fleet of ships, but an invisible, indiscriminate conqueror. The Black Death. It crept into the ports of the Byzantine Empire, a phantom passenger on Genoese trading vessels, and began its silent, horrifying march. In Constantinople, the queen of cities, the plague was an apocalypse. The once bustling streets, already thinned by decades of civil war and decline, fell silent. The historian and later emperor, John VI Cantacuzene, watched in horror as the pestilence consumed his own son. He wrote of homes emptied overnight, of bodies piled in the streets for want of burial, of a city suffocating under a blanket of grief and decay. For the Byzantines, it was more than a disease. It was a sign of God's final abandonment. Their world was ending not with the fire of a conquering army, but with the quiet, feverish death of its people. Across the water, in the burgeoning Ottoman domain, the plague also took its toll. No land was spared. But the nature of Orhan's state offered a grim, unintended defense. His people were more rural, more dispersed across the Anatolian plains and hills. His armies were mobile, living in camps, not crowded into ancient, plague-ridden tenements. While the Ottomans suffered, they did not collapse. The plague struck their enemies with a far more paralyzing force. Orhan, a man who understood omens and opportunities, watched the Byzantine world wither. He saw the plague as a scythe, clearing a path that his armies had struggled to cut. It emptied fortresses that his warriors could not take. It broke the spirit of a people he sought to dominate. The strategic map of the world was being redrawn by pestilence, and Orhan, ever the pragmatist, understood that the weakening of his great rival was a divine, if terrifying, opportunity. The balance of power was shifting not just by the sword, but by the breath of the dying. For decades, Orhan Gazi had seemed invincible, blessed by fortune. He had outmaneuvered emperors, conquered cities, and forged a state from the fires of the frontier. His greatest triumph, however, was not a fortress, but his son, Suleiman Pasha. Suleiman was the architect of the European crossing, the conqueror of Gallipoli, a warrior prince who embodied the Ottoman future. He was Orhan's sword arm, his chosen heir, the guarantor of his legacy. Then, in 1357, fate dealt a blow more cruel than any Byzantine blade. While hunting with his falcon near the shores of the Dardanelles, Suleiman fell from his horse. The fall was fatal. The news shattered the aging sultan. The invincible conqueror was reduced to a grieving father. This was a loss from which Orhan would never truly recover. The man who had faced down empires now faced the terrifying void left by his brilliant son. The psychological toll was immense. For a ruler in the 14th century, succession was everything. A weak or contested succession could unravel a lifetime of work, plunging the realm back into chaos. Suleiman had been the perfect heir, respected by the army, feared by his enemies. Now, Orhan looked to his other sons, particularly Murad, and saw potential, but also uncertainty. Was Murad ready? Could he command the same loyalty? The weight of the future suddenly settled upon Orhan's stooped shoulders. His own health began to fail. The fire that had driven him for over 30 years began to dim, replaced by a profound melancholy and a gnawing fear for the state he had built. He had secured a foothold in Europe, but he had lost the son he expected to conquer it. The aging lion, who had once shaken the world with his roar, now found himself contemplating the fragility of his own bloodline and the terrifying possibility that his grand design might die with him. The death of Suleiman forced a change in the line of succession, a moment of profound vulnerability for any dynasty. All eyes turned to Orhan's second son, Murad. He was not the celebrated conqueror his elder brother had been, but he was far from untested. Murad had been forged in the same crucible of constant warfare and administration. He had governed Bursa, the Ottoman capital, and campaigned alongside his father and brother. He was known to be pious, stern, and methodical, a builder where Suleiman had been a thunderbolt. As Orhan's health faded in the years following the tragedy, he dedicated himself to preparing Murad. The informal, charismatic leadership of the early Ghazi warriors was no longer sufficient. The state now required an administrator, a sovereign. Orhan, in his final wisdom, ensured the transition would be seamless. He presented Murad to the army commanders, the viziers, and the religious scholars, securing their oaths of loyalty. There would be no civil war, no destructive power struggle that so often tore nascent states apart. This managed succession was itself one of Orhan's greatest achievements, a testament to the institutions he had built. In 1362, at the age of 80, Orhan Ghazi's long and transformative reign came to an end. On his deathbed, he passed his authority to his son. It was more than a title. It was the passing of a sacred mission, the Ghazi's sword, and the heavy burden of an empire in the making. Murad, now Sultan Murad I, inherited not a fragile border principality, but a formidable power with a secure capital in Bursa and a strategic permanent bridgehead in Europe. He inherited a disciplined army, a functioning treasury, and a clear strategic direction, the conquest of the Balkans. Orhan's death was the closing of a foundational chapter, but the machine he had built was designed to endure. The son would now carry the father's dream forward, from the beachhead at Gallipoli, deep into the heart of Europe. When Orhan inherited his father's domain, it was one of many Turkish beyliks in Anatolia, a frontier lordship, powerful but provincial. When he died, he left behind the foundations of a world empire. His legacy is one of profound and permanent transformation. He was the true architect of the Ottoman state. While his father Osman was the charismatic tribal leader, Orhan was the visionary state builder. He established the first permanent Ottoman capital at Bursa, transforming it into a center of learning and commerce. He minted the first Ottoman coins, the silver akçe, a declaration of sovereignty and economic independence. He laid the groundwork for the elite Janissary Corps, a slave army loyal only to the Sultan, an institution that would become the terrifying backbone of Ottoman power for centuries. He created the office of the Grand Vizier, professionalizing the administration of his rapidly expanding territories. But his most earth-shattering legacy was etched into the map of Europe. Before Orhan, Turkish forces had raided the Balkans. They came, they plundered, and they left. Orhan changed the very nature of the game. By seizing Gallipoli, he did not just win a battle, he secured a permanent key to the continent. The crossing of the Dardanelles was not a raid, it was a migration, a permanent implantation of Ottoman power on European soil. From that moment, the fate of the Byzantine Empire was sealed. It was no longer a question of if Constantinople would fall, but when. Orhan turned the Byzantines from a regional rival into a vassal, and finally, into an isolated city-state awaiting its doom. He was a master of diplomacy and opportunism, using Byzantine civil wars and dynastic marriages as weapons of conquest. He unlocked the door to Europe, and his son Murad and all the sultans who followed would march through it, building an empire that would dominate the world for the next 500 years. The story of the Ottoman Empire in Europe begins not with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, but with the fateful crossing orchestrated by Orhan Gazi nearly a century before,